Now I'm with Eduardo Lopez, Dr. Eduardo Lopez from UCLA. He's an amazing inspiration in my life. You and Jeff have been an amazing inspiration, and I really want to thank you. That experience at the Masters of Urban Education was amazing. He's a true intellectual, a true human being, and he shows a lot of love to his students. And I always felt that during my time at UCLA. I was thinking about calling this the KOED, KOED talk. And we talk about real issues, healthy conversations about things that are difficult but needs to be addressed in education. So, Eduardo, he has a PhD, Claremont University, master's, San Francisco?
University of San Francisco.
University of San Francisco. And you created the UCLA's Masters of Urban Education and designed it. You all right?
Yeah, I mean, that was a while back, and I mean, that program was cut due to funding issues, but yeah, that was a big moment, I think. I was pretty excited to work with, because most of my time has been working with credential candidates, so those people who were in the first year of teaching. And then this program allowed me to work with people who had been in the classroom for 2 years or more. And on average, I think the folks that were there were somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 years. So it was nice to create the space for people who had been in the field for a time to come back and re-engage with critical frameworks and to think about the contexts in which they were teaching in. So that was exciting.
No, it was more than exciting. It was in a different space for, I think, a lot of teachers, because when you think about teacher education program, there's a lot of standards, protocol, but there's not so much individual attention on the critical aspect of teaching, like actually reflecting on teaching.
And I think also, I mean, I think that continues to be the direction that teaching is going in terms of what you just said. This focus on like strategies, focus on the testing aspect of it, that is going to make you an effective teacher. But we forget just all the other pieces of it that go into teaching in terms of understanding your students, understanding the context in which people are teaching, your role as a teacher, what is your purpose as a teacher. And I think that those conversations often get left behind. And I think in particularly those folks who are working in urban contexts and with working class, youth of color, those questions are even more important. So to thinking about how can we create meaningful curriculum and meaningful lessons that connect to students' lived experiences to help them understand what is going on, why are things created the way they are, and what role can they play to change those conditions.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about the program that was meaningful is that you introduced me to Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Press and Antonia Darder. And that really opened my eyes on the way I saw my students and me as a teacher. How did Pedagogy of Press affect your own views? I know it had a powerful impact on you.
I mean, as a like growing up in East LA, attending schools. I mean, most of my life I attended Catholic schools. I mean, I went elementary, middle school, and then high school, and then even my BA and my master's was in a Catholic university. And one of the things I always remember about going to schools was I always felt bored and that the curriculum always felt irrelevant. And I always resisted it, or I always did the minimum to get by. But I just never saw that school had any meaning for me other than that's what my parents as immigrants felt that was important thing to gain, because that was going to make your life better, or give you more economic success if you had more education. And I always struggled with finding why was it useful? What was I going to do with the math I was learning later on in my life beyond taking a test? Why did any of this matter? And it wasn't until my second year of college, the University of San Francisco, where one of the courses I was taking, it was called Intercultural Communication. It was a sociology class. They had us read chapter 2 from Pedagogy of the Press as one of the assignments. And I had never heard of the work. I wasn't really particularly motivated to read it. But in that chapter, it discussed banking education, right? So that in that chapter was, I think, the first time that helped me understand what was the purpose of schools, and why did I find it so irrelevant? Why did I find that as I continued moving through the educational system, there were less people like me, so that it was designed that way, that there was a purpose to that in terms of obedience and control, and that other folks who were of another social class had a different type of education. And so that education had a domesticating effect on different populations. And that really spoke to me, because I did, when you look back, it says, well, why did I learn all this Western European? Why didn't I learn about labor strikes? Why didn't I learn about the Chicano student movement? All that content had been erased. And there's a purpose for that in terms of trying to keep that information from you and developing consciousness around it, to think about issues of inequality and social justice. So I became really interested in learning more about the work of Freire. And then as part of that reading, we had the following week a guest speaker of Antonia Darder, who was talked about having been a student of Freire. And I found that very powerful, because Antonia helped me then, where Freire is talking about in the context of Brazil, of doing popular education with adults. Antonia then helped me to think about that in the context of the United States, of public schools and the educational system here in this country. And so that was really also powerful for me. And it was the first moment where I became really deeply interested in schooling issues and thinking about education. And it gave me purpose. I think I was floating around in school with just no direction, not knowing what I was going to do with my life. And so then I was really consumed with learning more work around critical pedagogy, which then I entered into the master's program there at the University of San Francisco, and I got my master's in international and multicultural ed. And so I got opportunities more to read about the work of Freire. And then when I finished, I was like, well, what else can I do? And then I forget, I was in a conversation with somebody and they said, well, you can do a PhD. And I was like, oh, well, what's that? It's like, well, you can do more advanced studies and you can pick your topic and you can do some research around it. And when I looked around, I remember just being so impacted by Antonia's work that I was like, oh, let me see where she's at. And so I saw that she was at Claremont. And so I applied to the doctoral program and was accepted and got an opportunity to work with her and continue my work around Freire. And then, I always describe meeting and working with Antonia as, other than the speeches and the work, what Malcolm would have been, Malcolm X, and Paulo Freire, who is thinking about education, just her rage against injustice, and always asking us that our work wasn't abstract; it always had to be connected to struggle, and to thinking about issues of capitalism, and to thinking about how does the role of the teacher helped not just to challenge conditions, but also transform them. And that was a very amazing experience to be in that space, working and thinking and reflecting all that work for that during that period of time. And then I also had an opportunity also to take courses in cultural studies, to thinking about the role of culture and popular culture in particular. It was just at Claremont, you had an opportunity just to take courses in other departments. So it was I was reading just a whole bunch of work from like all over the place, and not just thinking solely just about just the formal setting of schooling, but all these other larger systemic issues.
Yeah, a lot of people think that teaching's not a political act. What do you think about that?
I mean, whether they recognize it or not, I mean, I think they're always making political decisions, right? It's just a matter of whether you're naming it or not. So the way you arrange the room says something. The way you, where you stand and the relationship you have or you don't have with your students, the questions that you ask or you don't ask, the material, the subjects that you introduce, all of those are political questions that have some kind of political impact. And so, well, even if you think you're remaining neutral, that very stance of neutrality has a political ramifications and impact that whether, like I said, whether we recognize it or not, almost everything that a teacher does has some political implication, right? And moral and ethical implications in there too. So to say that that's not a question, it's impossible to divorce that. Even with children's books, right? Children's literature about talking about parents. So when you talk about mom and dad, well, then there's other configurations of families that are also on there that you're leaving out. Whether that's designed on purpose or whether that's conscious, that's still being left out, right? The California missions, when you're teaching that, Native peoples and what happened to them, like that's being left out or being erased. And so there's implications to that. But when there's science curriculum and we're not connecting that to environmental issues, I mean, there's implications to that. Teaching math as abstract without thinking that math can also be a tool for social transformation, you're leaving all that out, right? So again, whether we're conscious or not, it is political in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching a podcast or listening to a podcast with Tyrone Howard was saying that a lot of students of color weren't seeing their narratives in the literature that they were reading. And it sends a message whose history is important, whose history matters, and which history is hidden. So what do you think about, as far as that is concerned, what do you think about that, about what he said?
I mean, yeah. And also, I mean, who has agency? Who doesn't have agency? Like all of those issues, I mean, at some point you consciously or unconsciously like pick it up that, well, I mean, I remember very clearly, and I think this is a story that I shared with you. I was fifth grade or something like that. And I remember asking the teacher asking us at the beginning of the year what we were excited about and to learn about. And I raised my hand and I said, I would like to learn more about the history of Mexico. And my teacher said, you know what, we're not going to learn because Mexico hasn't contributed anything to history. And so therefore we don't have time for that, right? And so then when I go and visit my aunts and I go to like the National Museum of Anthropology and I see like the stone calendar and I see the other like artifacts that the indigenous people did. I mean, you see the contributions to science, contribution to math. It's you see like, well, okay, someone is saying this, and then you see an alternative truth. Then there's only one thing to say, that your culture isn't worth to study, and therefore other people's cultures, Western culture is not just superior, but it's the one that's made everything, which is not true.
Yeah, it's not true because there's different valid forms of knowledge and there's different cultures and different histories. We're not just, and that's the point that a lot of teachers, they tell their students to leave their culture at the door, There's a disconnect. They don't understand the students' lived experiences, their cultural world, and there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding from the teacher's perspective. And I think that's one thing that's important for teachers to actually critically understand their own positionality, their own worldview.
And to think that also like students' cultures and languages can also be like rich sources to be able to bridge or to help connect the curriculum that they're teaching it. And it could be more powerful also to be able to like think of those connections to help students engage. And we know this from like the little people stuff that people will do, right? Like that student scores will go up significantly when teachers are doing that. So even at the very basic level, if you're just interested in raising like homework completion rates or tests, academic scores, we know that that's like helps, and we know that has an impact on the level of student engagement. Even if you just want to think about it in that simplistic terms, right? We know that. I mean, there's other elements to that why we should be doing it. But I mean, time and time again, studies show that that students get engaged and excited about learning when teachers can make those connections.
Yeah, there's always this backlash against that because I think education has been kind of like a time capsule. When you look at it, the infrastructure is kind of a time capsule, but things are changing. The students are more diverse. And I think that's where it comes to love. If you love your students, you would try to understand their world, right?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, yes, students are more diverse, but I mean, that diversity has existed there for a very long time. And at the same time that there's more diversity, there's also increased resistance to it. Resistance, right? So we see the backlash right now around critical race theory, right? Like conservatives are up in arms, don't even understand it, but they're using it as a wedge issue to clamp down and to teach more traditional curriculum. And then like the other part too of it is also in terms of more control, right? More control around teachers' work, more control around testing. So we have both, right? We have increasing more of numbers of students, and then at the same time, we also have increasing more of the resistance and trying to clamp down and to keep the status quo. So it's like this push and pull that constantly occurs. I mean, we see an increasing of teachers of color, but still nationally, I believe it's something like 90% of teachers are white. I believe here in California, it's something like 80% of teachers are white still. Here we are, 2021.
Yeah, there's a disproportionate number of white white Anglo-Saxon teachers than there are the percentage of students of color.
Yeah,
and that's why understanding. But even that, I mean, teachers should try to understand the world that the students that they teach, right? Shouldn't that be kind of like?
I mean, you would think that that's something basic, but I think a lot of teachers also think that the content is more important. Right? So that if you accept what I'm teaching you, if you regurgitate that back to me, then that's going to translate into test scores. But we forget that at the very basic, at the very core, teaching is a relational component, right? And so oftentimes, particularly students who have had very oppressive experiences in schools are not going to care about what you teach before you care about them, right? And so they want to see that you are, that they're going to be safe, that you're going to address their concerns about their issues. And once you have some kind of relationship with them, then they'll do the academic work that you're asking them to do.
Yeah, but isn't it about the students?
You would think, right? But I think there's also
they are major stakeholders in this. I mean, it's their life, it's their future.
There is, but I think also to think about it I mean, and you've been a teacher, right? Of how I think oftentimes the relational aspect of it gets lost when testing is done at schools, where there's all this, right? Teaching stops, and especially towards the end of the year, you spend 2 or 3 months getting ready for those exams, and so it's a lot of like test prep. It's a lot of like drills. It's a lot about like test taking strategies.
Yeah,
And so you remove that because the focus, right? Then you go into staff meetings, and then people are looking at the data, right? And then they says, "Oh my God, look at how many kids that we're at D's and F's. So we need to push up those scores. What are we gonna do? Well, we gotta give them more remedial, right?" And so then you get all these kids dumped into remedial courses, and there are resistance, and you give them like really simple, watered down curriculum that kids are then gonna reject, right? They're gonna be like, "This is dumb. This is boring. We've done this." And then the teacher's going to get frustrated because then the kids are resisting, the kids are fighting back, the kids are talking back, right? And so what is the teacher going to do? The teacher's going to be more authoritative, is going to give like more discipline, is going to be kicking out kids. And then that's where people get locked in, right? Kids are reacting to their conditions of saying, we want something different, right? And then the adults don't read that as that. They says, well, these are just rude kids who don't care about schools, who their parents don't care about schools. And so we just need to kick them out. We need to remove them and only focus on the good kids. And so I think we forget that, right? In terms of asking that basic question is, why did this kid just do this? Why does this kid just start like refuse to do homework? What's going on? And I think those larger questions, I think that get lost again in teacher ed programs when we're saying, do the strategy, think about classroom management. And we need to go back and thinking about those larger questions as we're doing this work.
Yeah, and those are negative effects to students in general. I mean, students could feel dehumanized. They could feel dehumanized that they're just basically numbers or objects. And it's not relative to the student's world. There was my friend, he was a runner, right? And they were running this race. And they were so focused on running the race, they saw this old man on the floor. And they just disregarded it. They're like, what's this old? They just ran the race. Then somebody went up to him. He was having a heart attack. This is a true story. They were so focused on winning the race, they forgot that there's someone having a heart attack. And sometimes we don't realize that our students are hurting, are suffering.
And also just the material conditions that they experience, right? So we know something like 80% of students in, let's just take LA Unified, are at the poverty level, right? And so that's a huge number at the poverty level. The federal government defines poverty as what, for a family of four, something like $18,000 or $19,000 a year, right? And so when you think about how much is rent, how much is food, how much is electricity, right? Like how much could people be living off when they're only making around 18,000, especially right now, right? Housing and rent is escalating to the stratosphere, and it's leaving so many people behind. And if so much of your income is just going on rent, what does that mean for all the other stuff? So like those things also too, like impact student stress, students' ability to study if they're back home, to complete homework, to be fed, and it creates I think an issue that education alone cannot solve. It's not just about even if we can create the most meaningful curriculum, or we can create the best relationship with kids, there's all these other material conditions that need to be addressed, right? So not just educational reform or teacher reform has to be done. I think it has to be in conjunction with housing reform, with livable wage, right? Universal health care. Like all those other issues have to be connected in order to then improve schools and improve conditions in communities.
Well, this is our world. I mean, this is the world that we live in. I mean, shouldn't we? Yeah, we should try to improve the lives of the people that live in this world. I mean, it's kind of an injustice that what some of the students are dealing with: poverty, racism, hunger. I mean, and climate change. They didn't do anything to put this on them, on their lives. And but I want to talk to you about the pedagogy of love. All right. What do you feel? What is the pedagogy of love?
Well, look, if we go back to that earlier idea that I said about that, at this very core, teaching is relational. I always go back and I start with, for example, thinking about the work of Nell Noddings, who used to be a former math teacher, and then she did her care theory, right, where she said that we can define a caring relationship when there's let's just take person A and person B. And before person A can do a caring act for B, they have to do two things. One, they have to leave all their personal needs behind, right? So it's not what's important to me. And then think about who person B is, right? And ask themselves, well, what does person B need? And then based on those, enact the caring act. And then B, when B receives that caring act, needs to say, this act was based on what I needed, and recognize that. And then do the reverse, right? To say, what is then A need beyond just what I think I need? What does A need? And then do that act. So when those acts are mutually agreed upon, that they're based on each other's needs, then that relationship can be defined as a caring one. If I simply say, oh, I think B needs this, but B really didn't need that, and then B says, well, then that relationship is going to be disrupted because A did not understand who B was or truly needed was. So there needs to be a deep engagement into who that other person is or what that person needs in order to engage in those acts. Right, so that's the first level in terms of kind of thinking about. So then if we think then in that relationship, those acts are intentional, right? In terms of, and there have to be constantly, because we can't just say, I think I've done it, I think I know it, because those conditions are always changing. So I always need to be intentionally thinking or intentionally doing all the time, right? We always hear for example, the term say, I'm in love, or I fell in love, right? Love requires work, right? Love requires intentionality.
Yeah, it's a reciprocal relationship.
And it always requires us to constantly be doing that work. So then that's the second component of it, that it's intentionality, and that it has to be ongoing. We're never in a state of, we're never in a current place. We're always working towards that. So then if we're always thinking about the other person, we're always working towards it, then this engages us in this issue of, for example, what Freire is saying about solidarity.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Freire.
So it's an issue then of solidarity, that of because I love other people, and I then I'm constantly thinking about those situations, and then how can I work with others to change those conditions? That because of my love for others and because of the work that I do, then there is this radical love about solidarity with others to change that, right? I can't just say, oh, well, too bad, right? Or to say, I really care about you, but right now, like you said in the example, like I can't stop, and because my race is more important,
yeah,
right? I need to say, in this situation of the running situation, is whose need is more? That the person is injured, or my need to win, or to finish a race? And so you have to then say, okay, well then, if my love is for humanity and help for those their needs, then I need to make this choice, right? I need to engage in this choice to be able to address the situation, even if it means that I'm not going to get something else. Right. And I think that's the hard part. Right. I think that's where people then that's the challenge. Right. Then do we love? Are we constantly engaged in that aspect and that process? And that's really hard work. Right. It's really, really hard work, because it does mean to put into practice what you say. Right. And I think that's the difference too, is that a lot of people will say, oh, social justice this, but in our everyday lives, we can be very different people. We can be really mean and dehumanizing people, but yet in our public personas, we can be the most radical person, but in our most private and intimate, we can be these terrible human beings, right? So it's about practicing what we do, right? It's this idea also of a Freirean one about praxis, right? About connecting theory with what we do with praxis. So it's about the union of doing what we believe, that I think makes Freire's notion of love different than just simply saying, it has to be a reciprocal relationship.
So my last question is, what are you passionate about right now? What like fuels that blood and passion in you?
I mean, for me, is like right now, what we're doing is how can I think of the work of Freire, make those connections to the work that we're doing here in the United States and LA, and help teachers make sense of that work and why it's important to engage in these types of questions and analysis and frameworks to be able to change public schools. And so that's what excites me, is that when teachers are actively engaging these ideas and trying to make sense of, like, well, what would this look like with a kindergarten kid? What would this look like in an art class? What would this look like in a math or a science class? Is that people making these connections and reinventing the work to think about their particular context. So that makes me excited in doing that work.
Okay. We have one room. What's your favorite food?
Favorite food? Oh my God, there's lots of favorite food. I mean, carne asada. What else do I like? Mole, pizza.
Yeah, I know you went to Oaxaca. I know you tasted that mole.
So
lucky.
I like making pizzas too.
I love pizza.
So,
all right, dude, that was good. I'm gonna stop recording right now.
Okay.
1 second. All right, clap 3 times. Cool. What do you think about social justice leadership?
You know, when I think of the word social justice, I always think of addressing inequalities, like working towards eliminating them. But I think in that framework, you're starting from an aspect where there is something that has been taken away from. But if I think about what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of this pedagogy of love, then you're not thinking about from an aspect of what has been taken away from, but rather what do people need? And what is my role in that relationship of need, of love, and thinking about those conditions of people. And I think that changes the aspect, because rather than being like reactionary, because you're reacting to a condition, then you're also more in terms of thinking about like, well, how would I say this? In terms of first thinking about people's needs, and I think that changes the relationship more from that dynamic. So that's what I would say about that.